Today's Q&A is about chips, and the question is, what issues might there be with potato chips? So the most basic requirement for kosher food is that the ingredients have to be kosher, and that applies to potato chips just like any other food. And most people are surprised to hear that there are companies that fry their potato chips in animal fat, and it's straight out there on the ingredient panel. So obviously those chips would not be kosher, and the reason is because animal fat in the general public, it comes from animals that didn't have shechita. I mean, you can make chips at home with animal fat that's kosher, but if you're buying them commercially made, it's not kosher. Now, there are other companies who put other non-kosher ingredients onto their seasonings, like they put milk powder or whey or other things like that into their seasonings. Those are also an obvious question. Now, aside from the fact that some companies will fry their chips in animal fat instead of in like a kosher oil, you have to, even if your specific chip is not made that way, the question is, what other chips were made on this line? Did somebody use this, excuse me, did somebody use this same machinery to fry chips in animal fat? Even though yours were made in vegetable oil, did someone previously use it for animal fat? And what about the seasonings that we use? Now, again, your chip may have no seasoning on it or have a seasoning that's kosher, but what was on there beforehand and how well was it cleaned out or kashered in between? Now, a more, so to speak, hidden issue about eating chips is whether a Jewish person has to participate in the cooking or the frying of the potato chips. And that's because there's a halacha called Kashrus Yisrael that for certain foods, a Jewish person has to participate in part of the cooking of certain foods. Now, most hashgachas will say Kashrus Yisrael is not required for potato chips, and that's because one of the rules of Kashrus Yisrael is it only required if it's a food that would be oila shochem lachem, a food that you would serve to distinguished guests who come to your house. Now, potato chips are obviously not that. Nobody would serve potato chips as a formal meal to important guests, and therefore they don't need Kashrus Yisrael. Now, however, there are those who disagree, and they say they agree that it has to be oila shochem lachem. But they say the rule of shochem lachem means if there's any way to prepare this food for shochem lachem, then it needs Kashrus Yisrael no matter how you cook it. So, potatoes could be made oila shochem lachem. You make baked potatoes that are oila shochem lachem, and therefore any form of cooked potatoes, including potato chips, would have to be Kashrus Yisrael. And so those who take that position will only give hashgacha to or only eat potato chips that are made with a yid who is part of the production of those chips. And as I noted, most hashgachas do not follow that opinion. Now, this gets a little different when we think about corn chips, and that is there's a second condition of which things need Kashrus Yisrael, and that is it only is required for foods that are nechachai, they're edible raw. Now, at first glance, you say corn. Of course, corn is not edible raw. Everybody cooks their corn on the cob before they eat it. That's everybody does that. Well, but that's what most people think when they first think about it. But when we dig a little deeper, it turns out that corn on the cob is definitely edible raw, and you could try it yourself, so to speak. And the Shach says that if there's a food that is inherently edible raw, and people just prefer it in a cooked version, then that is considered edible raw, and it doesn't need Kashrus Yisrael. So that would seem to be our corn on the cob seems to be a good example of that. And in fact, when we did a survey of consumers, it turns out that a really nice amount of people, a healthy minority of people, actually do eat their corn on the cob without cooking it, and therefore it would qualify as nechachai, as edible raw that doesn't need Kashrus Yisrael. Now, everything I just told you about corn sounds right, except the problem is it doesn't apply to corn chips. It might be true about corn on the cob, but not corn chips, and that's because there are actually two types of corn. Corn on the cob that you might have in your house is called sweet corn, and that's a kind that's edible raw. But corn chips are made from something called field corn or cow corn, which is definitely not edible raw, and it needs lots of cooking in order to be edible, and therefore it does not qualify as nechachai, as edible raw. The only reason then to permit corn chips without Kashrus Yisrael is because they're a snack item and they're not served to distinguished guests. So it's like potato chips that they're not oila shochem lachem, and therefore they do not need Kashrus Yisrael.